Technological acceleration is increasing exponentially. To make sense of this acceleration, we speak to scientists, business leaders, and policymakers on our new weekly podcast, The Interface. This podcast is hosted by John Xavier, the Hindu's technology editor, who will keep you informed about the dynamic technological landscape and the mindset needed to navigate this terrain. So tune in to The Interface on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I'm Zubaida Hamid, your host for today. Avian influenza, commonly known as bird flu, is back in the news again. At least 4 states in India, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Kerala, and Jharkhand, have already reported outbreaks among poultry. The centre has asked all states to be vigilant and said all necessary measures have to be taken to prevent its spread. It's not just in India that bird flu is in the news, though. The United States has been battling this problem as the infection has now spread to cattle herds in several states in that country. Recently, the World Health Organization said that the A-H5N1 strain of avian influenza has become a global zoonotic animal pandemic with thousands of animals infected across multiple countries. While so far there is no evidence that H5N1 can spread from human being to human being, the risk remains for people who come into contact with infected animals. 2 cases were in the headlines recently, one of a child who was diagnosed with H5N1 in Australia, where she had just returned after a trip to Kolkata, and another case in Mexico, where a man died of a strain of bird flu called H5N2, which had never before been found in human beings. So what are the ramifications of bird flu in India? Who is vulnerable to the disease, and how can its transmission be curtailed? How do we ensure the safety of eggs, chicken, and other animal products that we consume? And does India need reforms in its poultry and animal food sector to ensure better safety of animal and human health? We delve into these questions and more with Dr. Subramaniam Swaminathan, Director, Infectious Diseases at Gleneagles Hospital in Chennai and Vice President of the Clinical Infectious Diseases Society of India. Good morning and welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast, Dr. Subramaniam.
Good morning.
Doctor, there have been a lot of concerns about the avian influenza epidemic of late. Could you explain to us what avian influenza or bird flu is?
So let's understand that influenza as a pandemic has been with us for probably millennia. One of the first zoonotic viral infections that jumped to humankind very, very long time ago. And it's been going round and round in circles as far as we can trace it. What we need to understand is that influenza has many, many variants, and only some of them are usually causing infections in humans. Therefore, as humans, we have immunity because of exposure or maybe vaccination to certain of these. But there are other recombinant variants of influenza which float around in the rest of the animal kingdom, and there are some in mammals, there are some in birds, and things like that. Generally speaking, they don't very easily move from one to another. But then that's always a concern. I think a good example was COVID, which we feel may have moved from bats to humans. So this kind of jump from an animal to a human is something that we are always concerned about, because can set off a pandemic because we don't have any prior immunity to these kind of pathogens, and therefore can represent a significant threat to our health and can also be very disruptive, as we learned a couple of years ago.
Specifically, when it comes to avian influenza, has this jump been exhibited now?
Well, as of right now, at least, in the last few decades that we've been monitoring this. See, the problem is we don't know if it's happened in the past. We can only talk about what we know in the last few decades that we've been monitoring the situation. So we have had outbreak of avian influenza in birds, and there's been large scale culling which has been done to control this, to make sure that you don't have a runaway epidemic which can then transmit to other animals including mammals and then potentially threaten jumping to humans. This one has been a little more interesting let's call it that, in that it has set off a chain of infections across the globe. The avian flu, this H5N1 as it's called, has been identified in many continents currently, and has been identified in many species as well beyond birds. So those are the 2 points which are very, very concerning. One, that it seems to be far more widespread, and the second thing is that it appears to have been now identified outside of birds. So those 2 points make it very, very concerning, and with a large scale transmission and very close interaction with humans, the probability of it jumping to humans appears a little more likely. And therefore, obviously, the regulatory agencies and the public health agencies are watching this very carefully, as also people like WHO, because you just don't want to be caught short, and that could lead to large scale havoc, as I just mentioned.
As you pointed out, the WHO is monitoring it and has said that this is a serious issue. The virus, because has now, is like you pointed out to us, is moving across to other species such as cattle herds
Yeah.
in the United States. Is this a possibility in India as well, that it could jump from birds to cattle?
Let's not just leave it at cattle, because in New Mexico they found mice, 11 mice, which have also been infected by H5N1. And the purported theory behind that is that they may have consumed unpasteurized milk which came from the cattle. So, the cattle get milked, and there is the milk is stored before pasteurization. It may be that these mice may have come into contact with that milk and then contracted the H5N1. So obviously, it's more than one non-avian species which is now infected, and if you include humans, that's three. So there's concern that there's already movement in the animal kingdom beyond the birds. So that is one concern. The second thing is that avian influenza in birds, at least, is not unheard of in India at all. We've had outbreaks of avian influenza in India in the past, and there has been large scale culling in many parts of the country. So that's not at all unusual. I think the most important thing for India that we need to be very watchful about is the case of this child who was detected to have H5N1 from Australia immediately upon return from Calcutta. I think that is something that I think requires a lot more attention and a lot more investigation, because we already have the possibility of a human case originating from India. And I think we have not done enough epidemiological work to trace out what's happening. I believe the authorities are hard at work at this, but I haven't seen any data coming out of it as yet. So it may be still early days. But I think this is where we need to have enhanced epidemiological surveillance. We need to be watching, bird and animal health, to see if there is any excess death in cows and birds and things like that. The other thing that happened in the US is that even before the H5N1 came up, so what they did was they've been doing wastewater sampling, and this is something that they learned from the COVID pandemic. So they went back to the wastewater which they had stored, and even a week before they started seeing animals dying of H5N1, they noticed that there was a spike in H5N1 in the wastewater samples that they had stored, that 7 days earlier. So obviously, we need to start doing wastewater surveillance in various parts of the country to see if there is a significant burden of H5N1 and whether it's rising in various parts of India. And that could give us clues as to where this is happening and where we need to focus our efforts. Problem is, for us to do surveillance and do large scale sampling across the country is very expensive, time consuming, and also very, logistically difficult. On the other hand, this wastewater sampling gives us an opportunity to get a snapshot, which can be repeated time and again as we think is necessary. And it will help us project where the numbers are going. And it gives us advance warning, because generally speaking, the wastewater spikes happen at least a week before a clinical spike happens. So I think we need to start looking at that kind of technology to help us. This is not new. It's relatively new from the from the COVID times.
Tell us a little bit about the virus's transmission to humans, doctor. You just talked about the case of this little girl who had returned from Kolkata to Australia and she was diagnosed with H5N1. How does the virus move? Is it only people who are in contact with farm animals who are at risk? What is the scenario in that case?
That part of it is not clear as yet. The problem is, as of right now, we believe that human to human transmission has not yet occurred. Again, it's a belief, we don't have data. But we have indirect data. So how do we how what is the indirect data I'm talking about? When they looked at the close contacts of the child who had H5N1, unfortunately, the 2.5-year-old child survived very well and went home healthy. So none of the domestic contacts or the healthcare workers who were in touch with the child immediately around the child contracted the H5N1, which is very, very reassuring. So it's probably not yet got the ability to transmit very quickly in humans. So that's good news. I mean, as of right now. The second thing is also the Mexican patient, which we'll probably come to a few minutes. That also, they did not show any transmission around the patient. Now, how did it happen as the index case? Now, that is a more difficult question to answer. Was this current child that we are talking about, this 2.5-year-old child from Calcutta, was the child exposed to any farm animals? Was there any evidence that the child may have come into contact with wild birds or even domesticated birds? We still don't have all that information. The only information that I did read was that the child actually had symptoms the day before it left Calcutta on February 28th and was seen by a local physician who correctly said that this is probably looking like a viral respiratory infection, which it was, and had just given the child symptomatic paracetamol, which is as per the guidelines. But why would we think any further in a healthy child, which is correct. But this turned out to be H5N1. So therefore, at that time, since we did not have all this information, there was no attempt made to epidemiologically track it down and see what happens. Let me also caution the viewers that even today, if you have a simple respiratory tract infection, it doesn't mean we need to go on a wild goose chase and start getting alarmed. This is just this one-off case that we are talking about. We should not be generalizing this to every adult or child who has a viral respiratory infection. So no, they don't need a whole $1 million evaluation to find out what's happening. But in this case, because we did not know about it, obviously at that time a epidemiological investigation was not launched. But the suspicion is that it must have come from contact with either an animal like a cow which may have been infected, or from a bird which may have been infected. But those are all at this point of time conjectures. We don't have enough data as yet for us to even know what is happening. Again, this is where, if we can have if we had stored wastewater from Calcutta, I think it would have given us information on how long this has been going on, whether it's still active, and a lot of other such information.
So, talk to us about the risks at the moment, doctor. At the moment, as you said, there is the risk for human to human transmission is very low, but from infected animal to human, when you're in contact with one, is possible.
That's the concern. As of right now, at least, we don't have proof positive that it will happen. There is definitely a concern that this could happen. So, obviously, big difference between could and will. In viruses generally, the multiplicative capacity is very, very high. They make lots of mistakes and therefore they keep evolving. When you have a large burden of viruses and a large burden of infected animals, the chance of this randomly jumping to a human would be on the higher side. And that's the concern. See, that's one of the reasons why we keep culling diseased animals and try to keep herds protected and things like that. As of right now, of course, vaccines are not an option. uh, Again, that was also in the works. But what we do know is that we are monitoring people in the farm sector, veterinary sector, and things like that, because we don't want any of them contracting the disease, and they could start potentially transmitting a human to human transmission chain. Again, far fetched at this time, but significant concerns. So, at this time, we are still monitoring that. The best way to prevent that, obviously, is to cull all the infected animals and make sure that you don't have a reservoir, and bring down the virus level in the community so that you can reduce the chance of it jumping to humans. So, as of right now, the greatest concern is for those people in the veterinary sector, people who are dealing with live animals. I'm not talking about people who have animal products for food. Eating chicken or eating mutton or something like that is absolutely safe. There is really no concern about that. But people who are in the animal husbandry sector or veterinary sector could have significant challenges, and they need to be careful.
You spoke a little earlier about the Mexican case. So that was the first confirmed case of a that the WHO said of a the death of a man caused by the H5N2 strain, which the WHO said was not found in a human before. What does this indicate? That the virus is mutating enough to be able to do this?
Again, let's go back a little bit. So H5 is usually all the avian kind of flu viruses, and with that you have N1 to N9, so they can combine whichever way we want. The usual avian flu we talk about is H5N1, and that's the one which is causing a lot of grief worldwide, in the US as well, and this child from Kolkata and things like that. The Mexican patient is a little different, in that there is a already a H5N2 transmission locally in their community in animals, primarily birds. So we know that H5N2 transmission is already happening in birds in Mexico, and so that's something which is already there. However, having said that, this transfer to humans is not something that Mexico has seen thus far. So this patient was an extremely vulnerable person, diabetic with end-stage kidney disease on dialysis, who is very high risk for infections and risk to life because of that. Who contracted this infection and unfortunately passed away. At that time, he was initially diagnosed only as influenza A, and it was subsequently speciated as H5N2. Now, this H5N2, so far at least, has not caused any major human problems, certainly not deaths. This is the first time a death has been reported. But how did this person get it is a bigger question. Epidemiologically, where did this H5N2 come to this patient? The patient, from what we have read, is that has not been in contact with any animal husbandry or birds or anything like that. So exactly how it is that the patient got to get the virus H5N2 is unclear at this point of time. But again, the good news is uh, domestic members and healthcare team members who have been involved in that patient's care have not contracted the H5N2 virus, which to a good extent is reassuring. But it still doesn't answer the central question of exactly how the patient got it. Again, please remember that when we try to get history about all these things, especially when the patient is very sick, we may not know the full details because we are dependent on family members giving us information, and their own knowledge of the patient's habits and their whereabouts may not be complete. Therefore, it is subject to a lot of recall bias. So we don't know the exact details of how it happened, but the fact that it has happened itself is an alarm bell saying we guys need to be careful, and maybe we need to monitor this a little more closely.
You spoke a little earlier about how, while there is some level of risk for animal husbandry workers and those in the vet field, it is totally safe to consume poultry and animal related products. Talk to us a little bit about that, because that is a general concern, when avian influenza epidemic hits, that can we eat
Absolutely.
eggs, can we eat
Absolutely.
chicken, can we eat any other animal related foods?
Absolutely. So let's be very clear about this. The first thing is that the regulatory agencies are very careful about these kind of viruses spreading in the animal industry as well, and that's why culling is something that happens once in a while, at least, to make sure that we don't have infected animals contributing to the burden of the disease. So the first thing that the general public needs to know is that culling is a mechanism that the government takes up to ensure that we don't have infected animals going into the pool of food. The second thing is, even for infected animals, the minute you don't consume raw products. See, that's why we don't recommend using raw milk or any raw animal products, simply because those are always a little risky. Now, once you cook it and once you process it, whether you pasteurize the milk or you cook the meat, it's no longer considered infectious, because although these viruses are all quite scary, none of them can withstand the methods of sterilization that we take up, which is basically cooking. So pasteurization and cooking will ensure the death of these kind of pathogens, and therefore it is no longer a concern to the consumer. So the possibility that a person is going to get an infection through either milk or eggs or meat is far fetched and too fantastic to believe. Obviously, there can be a concern if somebody is consuming raw eggs, raw milk, or undercooked food and things like that. So, yes, what we recommend to everybody is, as a public health measure, see, it's not just for these kind of viruses. There are other infections as well, like brucella and things like that. So, for a lot of reasons, we always recommend that animal products should be properly cooked and processed before consumption, like pasteurization for milk, and cook your eggs and cook your meat and things like that. And it's no longer a concern. So the general public should know that this does not mean that animal products are unsafe or can transmit H5N2 or H5N1. The answer is no, it should not be an issue.
Just looking at the broader picture a little, Doctor, you spoke about the various ways in which we could epidemiologically track this. So you talked one thing you talked about was collecting wastewater samples in order for us to have a little bit of advance notice as to whether the virus is prevalent in a community or not. So, looking at this now that this particular epidemic has become like a zoonotic pandemic, like in various parts of the world, what are the strategies that India can adopt in terms of do we need reforms in the poultry and the farm sector? Because as we know, only if we take care of animal health can human health also be
Yes.
safeguarded.
I mean, see, improvements and safeguards are always a welcome thing. So let's make sure we first document that there are already certain safeguards in place. It's not that there are no safeguards. Let's not have that idea. There are some safeguards. The question is, can we do better? There's always scope to do better. So let's start off with what we already have. So there is epidemiological monitoring, and whenever they have bird fall, meaning increasing deaths of birds or an increasing deaths of animals in any area, immediately the veterinary services go swing into action, and they perform investigations, including autopsies and studies, to find out what's happening. And the minute they identify something, they immediately propose measures to contain it, either in the form of culling or something like that, to try and see how they can curtail it. But we can certainly do better, because right now we are only reacting, we are not acting, we are not proactively doing anything to keep us safe. Our problem is we have to wait till uh, animals start dying before we start evaluating. And that, the problem is that once animals have started dying, it's going to take some time for us to do autopsies, do biological studies, identify this, and then enact a mechanism to kind of keep it safe. On the other hand, things like wastewater sampling will be able to pick it up even before symptom onset. Obviously, for that, you need to know what your targets are. The problem with that is, what do you check for in wastewater? You can't, meaning you can't just say check the wastewater and tell me what pathogen is there. It doesn't work like that. You have to ask a specific question. Like you can ask, is there COVID in the wastewater? Then you can check for that. Is there H5N1 in the wastewater? You can check for that. Is there H5N2 in the wastewater? You can check for that. So I think that's the big advantage there, in that whenever we see a signal any part of the world, then immediately we should start doing these kind of things, surveillance in the community, to try and see if there is a signal that the virus level of these things are increasing. So it's like I said, it's dynamic, in that if there is an increase in the viral load, in the titer of virus that is present in this, then the infection is transmitting, and more animals are getting infected. So obviously you can start putting in measures at that point itself to try and quarantine, or maybe even cull if necessary, and control the problem. This can also be a surrogate marker for human infection if you know how to interpret that. But having said that, that's a little more complicated. The point is that doing it animal to animal is a lot more difficult, because you have to sample so many different animals for you to know what's happening. Let us say, in an example like COVID, for example, I think that was a very good example. In COVID, let us say somebody has, you're setting a new infection up in a community. The point is that doubling time is so fast that people to people transmission is very quick, and before you know it, from 1 week it can be very, very low, and you need to check thousands of people to find a single case. A week later you will start seeing thousands of cases. So that's where wastewater sampling comes up. So wastewater sampling can identify it even before, a week before you find the first case, if you know what you're looking for. So I think we need to start looking at that kind of technology, combined with our existing mechanisms, to try and identify this. And then once we identify it, then proceed with correction measures. As of right now, unfortunately, we don't have anything beyond culling and quarantining, which I think is still reasonable. We really do not have medical therapy as yet for us to fix this. The other thing is protection. So even if we pick it up early, the question is, can we vaccinate and start protecting people? Now, that's also something that we need to touch upon. The Pennsylvania, if I remember it, UPenn has already come out with a mRNA vaccine, not only for humans, and they've started pilot testing that. So we need to start looking at options like that to try and see if we need to control it in human population if there is a concern that way. Maybe think about vaccinating people who are working with in the animal husbandry industry and veterinary industry so that we can keep them safe. So there are things we can do that way as well. But all of this starts off with identification of the problem and also understanding the magnitude of it. And I think that's where we need a lead time advantage. Current problem is that our identification is so late, we have very little time and we are actually behind the eight ball. We need to move in front, and I think that's where things like wastewater surveillance really makes a big difference.
There's been a lot of talk about how the conditions in which animals are kept and maintained also needs a push in the right direction. A lot of complaints about unsanitary conditions, etc. Is this something also that the government needs to take into account in terms of reforms?
I think that's a very, very important question. And I think there is significant concerns about this. Uh, Many of us who are in the everyday life, we rarely get to see the kind of conditions that birds and animals are being kept under. And for most of us who get to see this, we may not have a good night's sleep after that. There are no, I mean, let me not blanket say that everybody is doing a pathetic job. I know there are industry areas of the industry where the quality of work is actually very high quality. They actually do it the right way and things like that. But overall, I think there is lots of scope for improvement. The oversight in this also needs to be better. We need to have tighter regulations on how animals must be handled, and the use of growth promoters or anti-infectives being fed to them. Those kind of things need regulation and enforcement. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And while it is happening, my concern is that we are not moving fast enough in that area. But having said that, let me also say this. This is a problem not just in India, but across the world, including the United States. The problem is that the animal husbandry industry, there has been a lot of pushback in terms of resistance to governmental oversight, simply because this is a very high volume market, and therefore there is obviously concern about whether it is going to be possible and it will affect the livelihoods of so many people and things like that. But having said that, I think in the interest of public safety, we need to have greater guidelines, greater oversight, and it's about public safety at the end of it. I think food is important, but public safety is also important. And I think we need to find a point of equipoise where we can all be comfortable with it.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Doctor.
Absolutely pleasure.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.